Why don't we start out, and folks, I think, can come in as they want. We've got quite a few projects that we have to cover, and not a lot of time. So I want to thank you all for coming by to learn about the work that we've been doing in the honors program this year, and to celebrate the really wonderful work that students have done all year. I don't have to tell any of you how, what a crazy year it's been. And, of course, things had the potential to really unravel. I'm so proud of the work that the students have done this year in the thesis cohort under really extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Yes, let's give them all a hand. We'll do this several times. It's been really hard, and they have really been there to support each other. They haven't let up at all. I mean, I think they've really gone above and beyond in a lot of ways. I kept joking in the seminar that every time I would assign a 5-page draft, the shortest I would get would be a 7 or 8-page draft, and going up from there. Folks really worked hard at this. And tuned out all of the kind of extraneous and difficult circumstances to produce wonderful projects. And those of you who have done sustained research projects, just what a formative experience it is to do this kind of serious and rigorous work. And I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to work with everyone here and to see all of these wonderful projects finally come to fruition. I should say that we just heard yesterday from Weinberg that all of our theses have been awarded honors. So again, a big hand comes just in time for our meeting. And so, the result of this year's work have been 6, what I think are very impressive theses on a range of fascinating and unusual topics. Gabi Chohara's work on the unique cultural significance of the pig in Haitian and Guamanian literature, Riley Nelson's study of the effects of cross-gender casting in contemporary productions of Hamlet, Melissa Gauger's thesis on themes of colonization and subversion in Angela Carter's Nights at the Circus, Sam Nguyen's analysis of the role of female pedagogues on the early modern stage, and Lauren Katz's account of the way Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren make a space for female political agency through their epistolary correspondence. And finally, Caroline Schu's description of the tension in 80s nostalgia media between a conservative desire to resurrect the past as is and a progressive desire to be responsive to today's demands for the representation of more diverse identities. In a second, I'm going to have the students describe for us briefly their projects, and then allow some time for question and answer. But before I do that, I also want to take a moment to give a shout out to all of this year's advisors who have done so much to make these projects possible. They have also worked really hard in difficult circumstances, and they've been amazing, and their dedication to the program has been essential to its success. So let me just name them. Thank you, Sam. Yes, we do love you, advisors. Will West and Tracy Davis, who were both advising Riley Nelson's project in the theater program, but Riley was a part of the cohort all year, and we're so glad she's here to present for us. Juan Martinez, who advised Melissa Gauger, Casey Evans, who advised Sam Nguyen, Jim Hodge advised Caroline Shu, And finally, Kelly, I hope you're here, Kelly. I know she's on the road and was going to dial into the Zoom, but Kelly, who took on 2 advisees this year, Gabi and Lauren. So we are super grateful for that. So thank you. Thank you to all of the advisors. It's been great. So let's. Why don't we start? And I'll just tell you a little bit about the format of the program. We're gonna. I hope you've had a chance to watch the videos that students posted and get an overview of the project. What they're gonna do is give a short synopsis. Again, just to remind you of the project for about 5 to 6 minutes. And then we'll have about 10 minutes for question and answer, and we'll do that for each one of the projects. And I will try to be a little bit strict with the time, just so we can get through all of them in the time that we have. And we're gonna go in the order of the flyer that was sent out. So Gabi, you're gonna be first up.
Lovely. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. And can everyone see it? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Gabi Chohara. The title of my thesis is Sowing the Seeds of Imperialism, Pigs, Families, and Colonial Trauma in Edwidge Danticat's Breath Ice Memory and Craig Santos Perez's I Eat, Therefore I Spam. As I had briefly mentioned in my video, the 2 texts I bring together have several notable differences. Breath Ice Memory is a novel written in 1994 by Haitian-American writer Edwidge Danticat and can be categorized as post-colonial literature. I Eat, Therefore I Spam, on the other hand, is a poem published online by Indigenous Chamorro poet Craig Santos Perez, and this can be considered Indigenous literature. In his poetry, he describes the ongoing US occupation and militarization of Guam. The texts differ in genre, literary form, and discuss island spaces located in different geographical regions, the Caribbean and the Pacific respectively. While the texts seem to offer little grounds for comparison, I felt that both spoke to the impact of colonial occupation on food and the role it holds in previously and currently colonized spaces and peoples. Reading Elizabeth Delawry's Routes and Roots provided me with the foundation for placing the 2 geographical spaces in conversation with each other. Delawry delves into the theory of tidalectics, a dialectic or conversation between island spaces conveyed through the shared history of the ocean. She asks us to view islands as boundaryless and open rather than closed off and isolated spaces, as the latter definition aligns with colonial narratives of islands as being uninhabited, empty, and available for occupation. The former concept of islands allows us to consider the links between island spaces and shared histories of the colonially unmarked surface of the ocean. While Delawry offers dialectics of, quote, diaspora, indigeneity, and sovereignty between the Caribbean and the Pacific, I was interested in looking at food as a form of dialectic, specifically looking at the ways in which the legacies of colonial occupation are carried in and passed down through food, infiltrating bodies and families, and ultimately perpetuating these colonial legacies. After reading each text, I realized that the pig plays a significant role in both. In Breath Ice Memory, the pig is present in the form of livestock, evoking both its history as a tool of colonial invasion and its occupation of Haitian women's bodies. In the novel, it's passed down through matrilineal trauma, as well as a symbol of Haitian liberation and unification through evoking the night of Bois Cayman, which was the start of the eventual Haitian Revolution. In I Eat, Therefore I Spam, the pig acts as a vehicle for colonial legacy of the US occupation of Guam. In its processed and canned form of spam, spam was first distributed to Chamorro individuals during the reoccupation of Guam on July 21st, 1944. At the same time, the army meat is a crucial aspect of Chamorro identity and tradition, as spam is consumed on Guam, as more spam is consumed on Guam than anywhere else in the world. As this thesis called for a thorough explanation of context, and I began my discussion of Dantecott's text in my video, I will solely be discussing a short excerpt from Perez's poem. This excerpt depicts the familial infiltration and inheritance of colonially introduced foods and the violent legacies they can carry. The text I chose to introduce is, "My grandparents fed Spam to my parents, and my parents fed Spam to us kids. And I hope to one day feed my children Spam while I read the Bible to them. Spam is now a part of our cultural diet and inheritance. Spam is stapled to our blood." Here, Perez evokes familial and eventually in the entire poem, you could see more specifically patrilineal inheritance of food and the colonial legacies it carries. It is a deep, inevitable cycle passed down by the parents. Perez transfers us from the family structure of the colonizer, with Guam posited as this island, this orphan child, to Spam infiltrating Chamorro families themselves. Colonial fathers occupy the island and pass them down to other family members, in this case, colonial uncles. Spain is framed as a colonial father, spelled with a capital F, further evoking the Catholic faith that is brought over to Guam by the Spanish colonizers. The US is referred to as an uncle, as it basically received Guam for free following the Treaty of Paris after the Spanish-American War. It is also perhaps called an uncle because because its relation to Guam is typically not viewed as that of an empire in its colony. Guam is known as an unincorporated territory, not a colony. Now Perez's own father and his family prepare Spam and perpetuate this legacy, yet they do so in a familial, comforting, and non-violent manner. Perez explores this dual feeling he has towards Spam when the speaker states that Spam is stapled to our blood. Even in this excerpt, the speaker expresses eagerness to share this tradition with his own children. However, by saying that Spam is stapled to our blood, it's important to note that it suggests a violent process of becoming a staple of Chamorro culture. Stapling to blood further suggests that it does not need to be restapled to each generation. It simply becomes an inherited trait and a reminder of Guam's occupation. While the pig appears at different points in the text, only in a chapter in Dantecott's novel, contrasted with the entirety of the poem in Perez's text, and takes on different forms, either livestock or in the processed canned form that still exists today. Both instances suggest that it represents and embodies each island's space's respective colonial history and demonstrates how colonially introduced foods brought over during different time periods can still be the start of an important dialectic among island spaces. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabi. That was wonderful. So we're going to open up the floor to questions for Gabi. I don't know if you can raise hands in this version of Zoom. Dave, do you happen to know?
I think you can, Viv.
Okay.
I think so. Under reactions,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, it's under reactions. There's a raise hand function there.
Yeah. I prefer to just scream out when I want to speak.
And folks can do that too. Shout out. I see Kelly with a hand up.
Can you hear me okay, Viv?
Yes.
Okay, great. Gabby, wonderful work. Sorry that I cannot be a little bit more present. I'm in the car. One of the things that comes through, I think, so clearly in your thesis is the ways that these colonial legacies are also part of families. And so they're passed on in the kinds of family traditions that you're talking about in this little excerpt here. I wondered, like, what's your sense of whether Dantecott and Perez, what's your sense of how they see the future? Are these sort of ongoing colonial legacies that are going to be repeated, you know, for generations on? Do they give a sense of a different kind of future? Thanks so much.
Thanks for the question. Well, that was something I thought about near the end, especially when I was writing my conclusion of how both of them kind of discuss whether there is an end to this cycle. In Dantecott's text, I think it was only the beginning of kind of recognizing the cycle. There's a lot of like unspeakability of trauma, of this matrilineal trauma that is being passed down from the roots of colonialism of Haiti. And I think in Don Tacot's case, it's mostly just Don Tacot expresses the importance of speaking about it. And it may not even be like the start of recovery, because recovery just will take many like generations in order to like get to that point, and perhaps it will always be there. But I think they suggest that the first part of breaking this cycle, or even kind of learning how to cope with this trauma, is to begin talking about it, and is like sharing these stories and experiences, which in the case of Breath Ice Memory, it was basically unspeakable, and the Keiko women were unable to talk about it because it was that traumatic. In I Eat Therefore I Spam, however, I think many of Perez's poems reflect this kind of hope, or suggest this hope that he has, especially in like the Chamorro youth in Guam, in like recognizing what is happening to the island, especially since they are still under occupation and the US militarization, it continues to expand on the island. And I think it's very personal in his case, because he often talks about his daughter and his family in his poetry. And so I think we see this kind of difficulty, this like duality in how he feels about this with Spam. Even in like the excerpt I shared, that he does also have a love for Spam. It was in his family for generations, and he loves to eat it, and he wants to share it with his own kids. Yet it's difficult to continue consuming Spam without thinking about how it came to be there, and the ongoing presence of the US military that people in Guam see every day.
Caroline.
Hey, were there any like themes or ideas that you wish you could have spent more time researching or incorporating into your thesis that you just didn't have like space or time for?
Great question. Actually, yes, I was a little bit behind on both my segments, actually, both my chapters. But I kind of basically scrapped my entire Don Tacot chapter in the final week before the thesis was due. And I dug a little deeper into trauma and memory, just memory studies. And so Professor Wisecup recommended a lot of books by Kathy Caruth. And so I was just able to kind of skim them briefly, like her most important and relevant works to my thesis. But it was just so interesting. And I think it could have really been applied to Perez's text as well. And I was telling Professor Wisecup afterwards, I was just like, this is fascinating. Like for the whole day, I was just reading about it, about like memory studies and trauma studies, and related to like the unspeakability of trauma in Breath Ice Memory, and how this trauma plays out, and how it's not the woman's fault that there is like this cycle, that it's inevitable and uncontrollable, because it's so like deeply integrated and like ingrained in their bodies. So definitely I would like to, I'm probably going to read some of her works this summer. I'm really excited to read more on that. But yeah.
It's always the best sign that you want to keep reading on it.
After a little bit of a break.
Exactly. I saw Professor Wall's comment about the, how wonderful the focus on food is. And I wonder if you want to say just a little bit more about why it was that you were drawn to food in this way, and what that kind of lens does that's maybe different than other ways of looking at colonialism and empire.
Sure. So initially I began thinking about food and foodways when I took, I believe it was sophomore year class with Professor Wisecup on Native and Indigenous literature. And we spoke a lot about food sovereignty. And it was then that I began reading more on food sovereignty and recognizing what foods I was eating daily and where they came from, and foods that were colonially introduced versus native foods. And then when I took a post-colonial literature course, I also found it interesting how food was kind of discussed there. I was specifically reading a lot about Caribbean immigrants in Europe, in the UK specifically. But I just thought it was interesting how colonially introduced foods versus native or like traditional foods kind of intertwined with each other, and how native foods can also, or like colonially introduced foods can also become a part of just native traditions. And that doesn't make them any less authentic. And so I was really interested in that. It was a little difficult to bring together indigenous literature and post-colonial literature, because I know that's a difficult like territory to kind of navigate. And that's where Elizabeth Delary's work was really helpful. But it's difficult to bring such distinct genres together without making like a direct comparison. But I was just always like very interested in like food anthropology. And so Professor Weisskopf's class and then the post-colonial literature class. And that's when I asked Professor Weisskopf whether it'd be possible for me to bring these two together somehow. Did not expect it to be 40 pages about pigs, but I'm really glad that it ended up being that way, because I learned a lot about the colonial history of pigs and how invasive they were and how it really was a violent colonial tool. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you. And it is, I mean, I think the what you said there about it just making you aware of the way you inhabit the world every day, right? The things that you're eating. I think, you know, several of our projects, probably all of them, excuse me, that's our timer. You know, all of the projects, I think in some way have helped us reflect on things we do every day in the world. I know after reading your thesis, I find myself too thinking about the food that I'm eating in a different way. And that's the, you know, that's I think the best that can come out of the kind of work that we do. So let's thank Gabi.
Thank you, everyone.
And move on to Melissa. Well, I should say I didn't introduce Gabi's thesis topic. Her thesis title is Sowing the Seeds of Imperialism, Pigs, Families, and Colonial Trauma in Edward Jonticut's Breath, Eyes, Memory, and Craig Santos Perez's I Eat, Therefore I Span. And so Melissa will talk to us now about her thesis, which is called Now That's What I Call Discipline, Empire, Identity, and Otherness in Angela Carter's Nights at the Circus.
Yeah, let's get that Foucault going. Am I right, guys? Also, I'm outside, so if you like hear birds, that's just ambiance. Let's get that. All right, can everybody see my PowerPoint? You all good? All right. Okay, so I'm super excited to talk about my thesis that is on empire, identity, and otherness in Angela Carter's Nights at the Circus. So I chose Nights at the Circus for my thesis, mostly because I just think it's a super amazing novel that has a lot of really rich and exciting material. Do highly recommend it. Set in 1899, the novel primarily follows an American journalist named Jack Walzer through 3 locations, London, St. Petersburg, and then Siberia, as he goes undercover to write an expose on the circus. Now, because Carter herself is a huge feminist, most of the criticism on this novel deals with feminism or queer sexuality and the ways in which these ideas subvert the patriarchy. And this is all fine and good and totally makes sense. But since the circus in this novel is literally called the Imperial Circus, I instead became obsessed with this more underexplored question of how imperialism functions in the novel. Essentially, how does the circus, which is a space traditionally associated with subversion and disorder, wrestle with the idea of empire, which is alternatively tied to colonization, control, or surveillance, and so forth? So, in my research this year, what I found is that Nights at the Circus actually has a range of what I call alternative responses to this question of empire and imperial dominance. Every character or circus performer in the novel has a different way of reacting to the presence of empire. Some characters actually uphold the empire and support colonization and control, while other characters attempt to liberate themselves from these ideas, whether successfully or not successfully. In my thesis, I chose to examine this question of imperial subversion or is it possible to be liberated from empire in the circus, and what does that look like? Through two side characters, and these are the circus clowns and a strange little singer named Mignon. Now, in my first chapter of my thesis, and briefly in my video, I argue that the clowns' subversive attempts within the circus actually fail due to the fact they are trapped within the imperial discipline of the prison and the madhouse. Today, I'm going to attempt to walk through my second chapter, which deals with this character named Mignon, who actually does succeed in subverting empire within the circus. So, Mignon essentially succeeds because she undergoes a very unique Bildungsroman, or coming-of-age process. As we could see from this quote, Mignon undergoes a pretty positive development in Nights at the Circus. She essentially develops from this unconscious, fleshy phonograph who is totally incapable of subjective thought into a mature adult, or woman, with autonomy and agency, hence this phrase, newfound soul. However, the Bildungsroman is an inherently kind of problematic genre because it requires you to become alienated from other people through this process, and also to internalize the disciplines of your society, which in Mignon's case would be the imperial society of the circus, which I originally argue traps the clowns. So how does Mignon avoid that? How is her coming of age process different so that she is ultimately able to subvert empire by the end? Well, without getting into too much detail, because it is super complex, by utilizing Franco Moretti and Victor Turner's understandings of a coming of age process, what I found is that before Mignon even begins any kind of Bildungsroman or developmental process, she is first quite literally separated from the rest of the circus and all of the disciplines that come with it. Mignon enters what Victor Turner would term a liminal space, which is a sort of exiled, outsider position from general society that allows a developing individual, like Mignon, to subvert social norms and challenge social expectations. So here, in this first quote, the notion that Mignon would not sing in the ring shows that she sort of exists and develops on the outside of the circus. It is this physical separation that allows Mignon to develop a subjectivity, which in this book sort of manifests through her singing and her music, without internalizing any disciplines of empire or getting caught up in the same kinds of traps that the clowns do in my first chapter. Furthermore, Mignon's coming-of-age journey is different and eventually succeeds because she develops alongside another character named the princess, who is also in this similar state of exile or apartness from us. This shared exile means that Mignon and the princess can rely on each other and develop an important friendship without risking any kinds of alienation or internalization of the empire. So as we can see here, this phrase, twinned opposites, means that Mignon and the princess rely on each other and are actually necessary to the development of the other. So all's well and good. So when we move on to Siberia at the end of the novel, Mignon fully develops into a mature adult capable of creating her own music. And it is consequently the creation of this music with the princess that allows Mignon to subvert imperial society by bringing everyone together rather than disciplining and alienating them. As we could see in this quote, these phrases like taming and a not taming, or music that sealed the pact of tranquility, shows that Mignon and the princess, through their music, are able to cultivate a sort of utopian or harmonious community in Siberia without falling prey to imperial structures of control. Still, as a whole, Nights at the Circus remains super ambivalent as to whether empire can actually be subverted. Even though the novel ends on this seemingly kind of utopian or liberatory note, Carter also gives us quotes like this to remind us that all of the subversion we've just seen is likely not even permanent. In essence, Nights at the Circus simply explores different avenues and alternatives to empire without actually committing to one overarching resolution. And that's on that today.
Thanks, Melissa. That was
Thank
wonderful.
you.
So, questions for Melissa? Katie.
I'm so enjoying this. It feels like there's an overlap of reunion of my English 397 last spring when we first started doing pandemic research. And it's so delightful for me to see the continued fruits of pandemic research, because I know both how hard it is and how awesome so many of these students are. My question for Melissa has to do with Mignon's name.
Yes.
Because, right,
yes.
It's because, in the French, it's the masculine where you would expect the feminine, and is also the beginning of a very famous, very creepy sort of canonical French poem written to a young girl from the position of the much older poet, which begins, Mignon, allons voir si la rose, dear one, let us go and look at the rose. And of course, there's this long rose girl comparison. I'm wondering what you think is going on with Mignon being named this name in the masculine.
Interesting. I have never heard of that. I want to look into that more. That is absolutely
You didn't
wild.
have the particular trauma that I underwent.
So my thing with Mignon is that I did not get to talk about this because my speech would have been way too long. But her name directly references Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, which I think is what Carter's drawing on, because in that book, there's also a very weird girl named Mignon who sings, and the things that she sings in Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship actually carry over into Nights at the Circus, so it's like a direct reference. And it's just interesting, because that's how I got onto Bildungsroman, because Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship is the first coming-of-age novel, and in that novel, Goethe's Mignon doesn't develop and she just dies. And then in Nights at the Circus, she actually goes through this whole process. But at the same time, if we're going to go back to your poem about creepy man writing to young girl, Mignon's character is quite tragic in that most of her childhood she is abused by older men and sexually abused by a long range of older guys, so that may also be pulling into it. But I know she may also be French. But yeah, 90% of her character being Mignon is the Goethe reference, because it's almost like she gets a character, I don't know the word, a redemption in Nights at the Circus that she doesn't have in Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, because she just dies. It's really sad. But yeah. That's my take.
Gabi, go ahead.
Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Gabi.
So I know that when you were working on your thesis, you were kind of there were just a bunch of different characters that you were looking at because everyone was very interesting in this novel. And so I was wondering if you could kind of expand on your thesis or write an additional chapter. Is which character would you focus on next if you could? Because I know you were interested in a lot of them.
Well, Gabi, it is true. Nights at the Circus has a ginormous ensemble cast, and I only got to talk about 2. But when I was writing my second chapter on Mignon and the Bildungsroman, I started to notice that the character Jack Walzer, who I mentioned at the very beginning is the protagonist, would probably be my candidate for the 3rd chapter, mostly because I find him to be the weirdest character in the entire book. What I noticed when I was studying Mignon is that while Mignon develops from weird unconscious person into cool, mature singer who subverts the empire through singing, Walzer goes to the opposite, and that he begins the novel as this American journalist who's kind of a symbol of empire and the coming America being imperial in the 20th century, etc., etc. And then as the novel progresses, it's he loses a little bit of that imperialness until he is literally an infant at the end of the novel, because he loses his memory and he doesn't understand anything, and he has to be retaught how to speak and how to read and how to eat. And I just find that very fascinating. And I think it would probably complicate my thesis a lot if I tried to add it. So I would really like to.
Melissa, if I can follow up on that, you did focus on minor characters.
Yeah, so if I were to expand it, I would bring in a main character. Mostly, I know that he is a protagonist, and my whole thing was like, I'm not going to focus on protagonists. But I do think that Walser is pitifully under-analyzed, because when I was reading criticism, he's usually analyzed like in relationship to the other protagonist who has a lot of stuff on her, but nobody just writes about Walser by himself. So that in that way, I'll justify it.
That's interesting. And I'm wondering also if you think that Carter herself is in some ways changing the relationship between minor characters and protagonists to, put more emphasis on the ensemble of characters rather than a single or one or two important figures. I do think that's happening. And I also, coming back to Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, because we all love that book, I think Walser is a stand-in for Wilhelm, and that was one thing I never got to touch on when I was doing it because I never wrote on Walser. But he's kind of like a reverse Wilhelm, where he starts good and then ends bad. But it's because Walser and Mignon, that's how I got onto it, have that same weird dynamic that Wilhelm and Mignon do. So be great to look at.
That's wonderful. I see a question from Professor Evans. No, not a question, but it's
just a book recommendation. That's all I seem to be able to come up with today. Is this reminds me of another book you should read.
Thank you.
Celebrated properly and had some time to breathe.
Thank you.
Ronit, you have your hand up.
Hi, Melissa. My question for you is, I'll preface this by saying I haven't read The Night Circus, but you talked a lot in the beginning about how, or Night at the Circus, about how Carter is usually looked at through a feminist lens. And I was wondering how you think that's kind of linked to the fact that at the end, the one person who's kind of able to break this like imperial whatever is a woman. And I don't know if that's linked. Like I said, I haven't read it, but I think it's really interesting that the one character who kind of can break this is a woman who has been kind of abused by older men who uphold those cycles. And
I do definitely think it's connected, because you can look at Mignon particularly through a feminist lens, and critics have, because I know I said that she and the princess have a friendship, but they are actually lesbian lovers. And I think from a feminist lens, the reason that she succeeds is because she like abandons men and like enters this lesbian relationship. And there's a lot at the end of the novel. There's like a lesbian prison commune that I did not even touch, but that also like they're also some of the only people at the end of the novel who are like able to successfully kind of leave the empire. So I do think that who succeeds is tied to gender, just because Carter is like a massive second wave feminist like writer, and that's gonna show up. But she's also critical of it, and she doesn't fall into the trap of being like women are, the future, and like we're the kind of the stuff that we're like, that's not completely true anymore, like lesbian separatism and all that. But I do think there is a direct link to the fact that Mignon is a woman and is the one who succeeds in feminism.
Thanks, Melissa. Let's all give Melissa a hand. It's a fabulous project. And I want to have us move on to Caroline's thesis, which is called Strange. I love these titles too. They're so wonderful. Strangest Things: Nostalgia versus Representation in Kids on Bikes Media.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Caroline, and I guess you just heard the title of my thesis, so I'm not going to say it again. But basically, I'm interested in 80s nostalgia media as the staging ground for a conflict between nostalgia and representation. So I define 80s nostalgia media as a fantasy of the 1980s inspired by iconic horror, science fiction, and coming of age narratives of that era, as well as just like childhood in general. And the goal of an 80s nostalgic text like Stranger Things is basically just to recreate this fantasy as closely as possible. The problem, I argue, is that it's really difficult to express nostalgia for the pop culture of the 1980s without also inadvertently expressing nostalgia for the politics of the 1980s. And then contemporary representation culture is like a kind of newish phenomenon of the past 5 to 10 years. And it's all about making a concerted effort to represent marginalized identities in a way that makes audiences feel seen. And because this is such a new phenomenon, I feel that it's inherently incompatible with 80s nostalgia media. So the body of my thesis is basically just a bunch of nostalgia versus representation case studies. Each case study is a scene or character that tries to represent a certain marginalized identity category to varying degrees of success. But today I want to talk about the only case study that I think manages to pull off this balance between nostalgia and representation. Let me share my screen. Okay. So in season 3 of Stranger Things, we meet a new character named Robin. She's on the left. She's played by the actress Maya Hawke. And at the end of this season, she comes out as a lesbian. This scene was really well received by critics and audiences, which is kind of surprising because a coming out scene is pretty different from what we might expect from like a classic 80s teen movie. And it actually was a pretty big risk for Stranger Things to attempt this kind of scene because historically, the fans of this show have reacted really poorly anytime the show diverges even a little bit from its established 80s aesthetic. There are no 80s teen movies where a character comes out as queer. And furthermore, what we understand today to be the trope of the coming out scene didn't really exist until 1997, which is when Ellen DeGeneres' character came out on her TV sitcom Ellen. So even though there seems to be this fundamental incompatibility between 80s nostalgia and queer representation, I still think that this scene manages to kind of smooth over that incompatibility pretty well. This scene is also a really good opportunity for me to talk about some of the nostalgia evoking techniques that Stranger Things uses most frequently. And a lot of these techniques are conspicuously absent for this scene and this scene alone, which I think is a subtle but effective way for the show to briefly transition out of nostalgia mode and into representation mode. So one of the tactics that gets used most commonly is music. The show is full of iconic 80s songs like Africa by Toto and Every Breath You Take by The Police. And its score is also deliberately composed to be nostalgic. So given that music plays such a huge role in establishing the nostalgic aura of the show, it's particularly conspicuous that large chunks of this scene have no music at all. And the parts that do are like sort of uncharacteristically subtle and quiet. Another technique that gets used a lot to evoke nostalgia is like the throwaway 80s pop culture reference. These kinds of references are incessant and gratuitous. They don't add anything to the plot. They're just kind of there to create the 80s vibe. So we get one of these references right before the coming out scene. It's to the movie Back to the Future. We get one immediately after. It's to the song Total Eclipse of the Heart, but there's nothing during the actual scene itself. And I argue that this lack of overt 80s-ness in this scene relative to the rest of the show does double duty. First, it kind of dials back the nostalgia factor and creates space for a scene that aligns more closely with contemporary standards of representation. And then second, it also helps the scene fulfill the contemporary requirements of the coming out scene, which are all about sympathy and understanding and attention, undivided attention with no distractions from the character who's coming out. And then I guess just as a whole, I think that 80s nostalgia media is a really fruitful opportunity for us to dissect what nostalgia and representation actually are. So we often think of nostalgia as like this really personal and apolitical feeling, but I think that 80s nostalgia media reveals to us how difficult it is to be nostalgic without also being political alongside. And I also think that 80s nostalgia media reveals to us the limits of contemporary representation culture. So it's like really nice and wonderful that all of these texts are trying to represent minority identities in like a really nice and positive way. But 80s nostalgia media reveals to us that this is often a lot easier said than done. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. This is another one of these theses that like Gabi was talking about. I mean, I think we're all just inundated with 80s media at the moment, and it's just wonderful to actually have this framework that Caroline gives us to think. It raises a set of questions that I wouldn't have come to on my own. It's just really wonderful. I already see 3 hands up. Jim, you want to go first?
All right, it'd be my pleasure. This is a broad question about what it was like to do this project, Caroline, and this is also a question aimed at our visitors who are from outside Northwestern who are visiting, who are welcoming here. Usually in English departments, we have great texts. Either we call them canonical or exemplary texts, but we study them because they're thought to be really rich and singular and examples of high artistic achievement. But when you focus on popular media, that's not the goal, right? And so I'm just wondering what your general reflections are on working on something that's on popular media texts that aren't necessarily great, capital G great, or things that we expect to be canonized someday or something like that. Can you give us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so generally I actually have a really hard time writing about things that I think are good, just because I feel like scrutinizing it too much kind of like ruins it for me, or I feel like so much reverence for it that I like don't wanna like pick at it. So it's more fun for me to write about something that I think is like kind of bad, but like interesting. Yeah, I picked 80s nostalgia media because I think it's like the weirdest thing in the world. Like I don't understand why all of a sudden this is what we like and what audiences are demanding and what producers are trying to give to us. I just think it's fun to like pick something that you don't necessarily love it for its quality, but it just has like some sort of interesting, it's just like bonkers. Like it doesn't make any sense.
Although you made very good sense. Nick.
Hi, Caroline.
Hi.
First, I'm just so happy that my wishes to the universe to be your second reader were heard. It was one of my only wishes to the universe that got heard in the last year and a half. And it was a great one. I'm going to ask a question that I teed up a little bit in the response that I wrote to you, but I'm curious about your thoughts about Stranger Things. Let's say the way it conducts itself as though to address these questions of representation or meet that appetite that you describe in the thesis are accomplished by adding characters and maybe participating in a discourse that we hear all around us all the time about how questions of inclusion or diversity are about being additive to a structure that already exists instead of how the show might have behaved, which is to find some different lenses on the people we already knew or dig more fully into experiences we had been tracking from the beginning. So do you want to talk about those dynamics, both within the text or even kind of ideologically?
Yeah, I agree that it's weird. And I guess what's interesting is that as I was like trying to figure out like what was going on with this Robin character, whether she was like explicitly written to be like Stranger Things' resident lesbian in season 3, I learned that she actually wasn't supposed to come out. Well, I learned that they don't plan out Stranger Things before they start filming. They write the first couple of episodes and then they just kind of wing it from there, which is interesting. But the decision to have Robin come out like came about from the actress talking to the creators of the show, and they just all kind of decided that she was going to be a lesbian and that she was going to come out in this scene. So I think if we take into account like process or like what she was supposed to be compared to what she ended up being, she's kind of like in the middle of that sort of additive situation. Like we could have easily, I think you mentioned in your response that like a character, one of the little kids in the Stranger Things gang, Will Byers, is like, there's something going on with him. I don't think he's straight, but like he's like 12, so I'm just gonna leave him alone. But yeah, it is like sort of odd that whatever group or whatever cast forms the heart of the show, they can't become representative. It has to be someone new that gets added into the fold. I don't really know what all that's about, but I feel like it happens all the time in like popular media. They never whenever demand rises for a character to be representative, either in terms of like sexuality or gender or race or whatever, they just bring in someone new. They don't do anything to the people who are already there.
Thanks. I see Nathan's hand up.
Yeah, hi Caroline. Really love the thesis. Also love the hair. My question was about nostalgia as a concept. What does it mean to write about nostalgia for a time that you personally cannot, at least in the classical sense, be nostalgic for? How did that shape your writing? And do you think this would be a different paper if it was for a time you were nostalgic for?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that drew me to 80s nostalgia in the first place, is that like when I watched Stranger Things, I was like, oh, the 80s, like childhood in the 80s. And then I was like, what are you talking about? Like you were born in 1999. Like this is nothing to do with you. I think it's, I guess, like a really, I guess, commendable trait of 80s nostalgia media, that it's like really good at getting people to feel nostalgic for a time that they did not live in or that they have no personal relationship to. And as I was like kind of doing preliminary reading for the project, I came across this like sociological tract about nostalgia from like 1979 called Yearning for Yesterday. And it had this like theory that as time moves forward and commercial media and mass media become more common, that the object of nostalgia will shift away from like personal experiences. So like, oh, like my grandma's like cookies or whatever, I'm so nostalgic for that, to media. So like, oh, like the movie Frozen. I like watched the movie Frozen when I was 12 and I'm so nostalgic for Disney. So as mass media becomes part of, or like a bigger and bigger part of what our childhoods and like formative experiences are, the more that nostalgia will be for like movies or shows or products, as opposed to like a personal memory that you experienced in your childhood.
Casey, I see your hand up.
Thanks so much. This is an awesome project, and I don't know Stranger Things, but I do remember the 80s. So this is making me think maybe I should give it another try. I couldn't get through the first episode, to be honest. But I wanted to ask you about nostalgia. And this is just like a knee-jerk move on my part to go to the etymology of the term, that it means the pain of going home, right? And I wanted, especially because you're interested in talking about inclusion and representation, whose pain is it when we feel nostalgic, and maybe especially to build on Nathan's question, when we feel nostalgic for something that maybe we didn't even experience? Where does that pain come from, do you think? That's a really speculative question. It's not a question about the text that's asking you to read the text, but it's one of the questions that I think your work is prompting me to ask. And so I'll throw it out there, even though I don't think it's really a fair question or one that you should necessarily have a totally decisive answer to.
Yeah, well, I guess in the context of like 80s nostalgia media, it's come under fire a little bit for being like for white boys who were nerds. So like 80s nostalgia media is all about like Dungeons and Dragons, video games, Star Wars, and so on and so forth. And like really privileges like the emotional experiences of like a white nerdy kid boy who was bullied. So a lot of it is about sort of like vindicating that experience, which I think is kind of interesting just as a side note, because like the kinds of media that like the nerdy kid in the 80s liked back then are now like the most lucrative box office draws now. So like it's not like nobody's oppressed for enjoying Star Wars anymore, which is interesting. But yeah, I think it's in the context of 80s nostalgia media, it's kind of like this sort of fantasy of like becoming the main character, even though you were bullied in middle school for having like a bowl cut or whatever.
Great. Let's give Caroline a hand. I hate to cut these conversations short. I think you guys can see how wonderfully generative all of these theses were, but we have to move on. And we're going to move to Lauren, who wrote about revolutionary women, literary performativity, classical pseudonyms, and the public sphere in the correspondence of Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren. Lauren?
Hi, everyone. I am also going to share my screen. So first, I'm just going to give a little bit of a recap of my video. So in my thesis, I examined the epistolary correspondence between Adams and Warren from 1775 to 1777. During this time, these women engaged in a nuanced dialogue and literary performance in which they reimagined the relationships between the classical and the modern, the stoical and the sentimental, the public and the private, the national and the domestic, the masculine and the feminine, as a means to ultimately actualize their historical and literary voices. So why did I turn to epistolary writing? During the late 18th century, many women's writings took place in very unconventional genres, one of which being letters. And I was particularly fascinated by letters because they occupy this unique intermediate space between the private and public spheres, which led me to really hone in on my thesis and think about approaching letters from a microscopic literary perspective rather than a more macroscopic historical perspective. How am I reevaluating the private and public spheres in relation to gender? I mostly launch off of Elizabeth Dillon, who challenged some concepts by Michael Warner as she started to include women in the conversation about the public, claiming that women were represented in the literary public sphere and that powerful public images of femininity identify women as private. I definitely engage with their ideas of abstraction and individuation to talk about how women imagined ways to use both of those qualities to revise the relation between the public and the private. And finally, really briefly, how can performativity mobilize women? The performative potential of letters was not only in the public sphere, but was also seen in the private sphere through the creation of what I kind of termed the literary pseudo-public sphere. A lot of the times this was manifested through Roman allusions and pseudonyms, and while the most commonly known ones were those taken up by public male figures, women also used Roman pseudonyms in their letter writing. For instance, on August 27th, 1775, Adams first takes on the name Portia, who's Brutus's wife and Cato the Younger's daughter, in her correspondence with Warren, and Warren ends up responding using the name Marcia, which is Cato the Younger's wife. So I'm not going to go through my whole thesis, of course, but I want to talk about how the two of them, while both concerned with the same end goal of figuring out how to best carve space for women's historical literary voices, under their letters with the names Portia and Marcia, they both choose to experiment with very different approaches. And I talk mostly about Adam's approach, especially part 2, in my video. And so for this one, I'm going to talk about Warren. And I think that the other video really sets up the dichotomy between the two of them well, because the two of them test the bounds of epistolary performativity in very different ways. While Adams kind of figuratively hops around and out of her body, taking on multiple literary and historical personas, Warren stays rooted within her own body, reassessing the potential behind her own held identities as a playwright and historian. So Warren really starts to highlight the limitations of Adams' classical performance of stoical republicanism and opts for a new philosophical lexicon altogether, sentimentalism. So you can see here, Stoicism is very much rooted in patriotism and virtue, as the etymological roots of these words suggest they are also very much deeply ingrained with masculinity. However, in the 18th century, sentimentalism redefined virtue as above all a feminine quality by conveying women as moral cultivators for men and grounding virtue in the private feminine sphere. And in addition, Warren recuperates the sentimental, flipping it on its head to show that instead of associating Stoicism with pragmatism and sentimentalism with idealism, she strives to kind of show how Stoicism can be seen as ideal and sentimental can be seen as pragmatic. And here's her example of her starting to challenge Adams. So in this quote, the high enthusiasm of the truly patriotic lady will carry her through every difficulty and lead her to every exertion. Patience, fortitude, public spirit, magnanimity, and self-denial are the virtues she boasts. So in this quote, it's very clear that she is showing that Adams has made this notion of a patriotic lady synonymous with the Roman ideology of Republican Stoicism, as this line is very much steeped in Roman and Stoical illusions and virtues. However, the insertion of the words high and boasts add this sense of vanity that starkly contrasts the selflessness required of a Republican Stoic, showing that Adams' ideals of Republican Stoicism might not be fully feasible and achievable. She also, in the second quote, employs stoical humility, similar to as Adams does in letters that I talk about in the earlier chapters, though she does so to dismantle the Republican philosophy and admit that she's not actually strong enough to live up to the Stoic ideal. Warren's choice to identify under her public roles as a playwright and historian in her private epistolary correspondence to Adams originally confused me because I wasn't sure how she was going about employing performativity in the way that Adams was. But I started to realize that there must be something different that letter writing under these personas that she already occupies in the public sphere does for her. And the way I figured that out is I thought about the public works that she has engaged with and how all of these works are using a cluster of Roman Republican heroes, who are all men, to embody public leaders in the American Revolution, who are also all men. So in her public works, she is not able to renounce the traditionally male-dominated use of the exemplar theory of history, and ultimately, therefore, in her private works, through letter writing, she's actually better able to actualize her roles as a playwright and historian because she's much more free to carry out her own sentimental philosophy and create portraits of real contemporary female characters. And just really quickly, here's an example of one. She talks about the Amphicyonic ladies, and they become a new exemplar history for her to build off of. One of the Amphicyonic ladies to whom the females of the United States must in the future look up for the examples of industry and economy. And I basically talk about in my thesis how the Amphicyonic League is a system of governance in ancient Greece, though Warren decides to substitute the word league with ladies, creating this new image of a group of female leaders and creating this new lineage of exemplar history for women to build off of. And that ultimately, Warren is able to complicate the idea of literary performativity by assuming a persona of a playwright and historian, two personas that she has already in the public sphere, rather than embodying a character that is located outside of her own sense of self. And she really taps into her new historical and literary voices through her epistolary correspondence, paving the way for a modernized use of the exemplar theory of history that ultimately originates with the female paragons of the present, rather than the Roman stoical matrons of the past. And yeah, that's all I have.
Thanks, Lauren. Let's see. Do folks have questions for Lauren? I'm just looking at the chat. Kelly, I see your hand up.
Can you hear me again now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Lauren, thanks for this presentation and great work on your thesis. One of the things I loved about your thesis is the ways you thought about letters, not as texts that a single person would read, but as really communal texts that were read aloud and maybe performed and really shared among folks. So I see both and so I'm wondering how
Kelly, you're breaking up, unfortunately. Kelly,
the chat.
can you hear me? You broke up a lot. Your question was not really intelligent. She muted.
She might be putting it in the chat. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Why don't we go to Gabi's question, and then we'll take Kelly's question next.
Okay. Hi, Lauren. First of all, amazing job on your presentation. And I know you also major in theater. And so I was kind of wondering how that and your other interests like helped your thesis develop and how you maybe like incorporated those in your thesis.
Yeah, thank you. So I would say I got really interested in the idea of counter storytelling kind of near the beginning of my time at Northwestern through English, which I then also started pursuing through my major of theater as well. I also wrote my high school senior IB extended essay on T.S. Eliot's the use of pagan, Greek, and Roman mythological allusions in the wasteland. So I was already interested in this idea of the classical and its relation to modernity. And I think I didn't get the element of epistolary performativity from the get-go. I didn't really think about that in terms of letters. And then all of a sudden it kind of clicked that there's this theatrics going on with the use of embodying these names. And I think it extremely helped me with my Adams section. I know I'm also like a musical theater songwriter, and I have learned a lot about creating the world of a play and creating the world of a song and making sure that you establish the permissions of a song. And so in the opening number of a musical, you have to, if it's a comedy, you have to establish the permission to laugh in that number, or else people for the rest of the musical won't buy it and won't be on board with the fact that it's a comedy. And if it's a musical, you also have to establish the permission to dance in the opening number, etc. And so that I think helped me really conceptualize what Abigail was doing with Portia, and helped me zoom out a little bit to be less honed in on just specifically why she's using Portia, what's specifically with that name, and thinking about Portia as more of like eventually this catalyst and this permission for her to be able to access the classical and access the antiquity, and ultimately embody different personas and what I kind of term in my thesis body hop. So I think that was a really helpful bridge for me.
Will, you were next.
Yeah, thank you for this. That was an extraordinary presentation and really interesting. And I just, this is sort of a question that wants to be a comment, or a comment that wants to be a question. Did you think about in the line about the amphitryon, I think it was amphitryon ladies, did you think about Plautus's Amphitryo at all? And Amphitryo as a figure from mythology and from ancient theater. He's the father of the twin of Hercules. And I was wondering if there was something going on there with the idea of these are the women who are giving birth to this heroic new national identity or anything like that, rather than the strictly historical reference.
Yeah, I actually didn't know about that connection. So that's super interesting to think about. But yeah, the mythology involved. I feel like for my thesis, while I've dealt with like mythological allusions in the past, I feel like for this specific thesis, I was pretty grounded in a little more of the history, though I wanted to make sure that I think one of the hardest parts of this thesis was creating a balance between how much historical analysis I do and how much literary analysis I do, because I really wanted to make sure that what was different about the way I was examining these letters was really through a literary lens, though it was also impossible to do that without having historical context behind it. But no, I think that's extremely interesting. I immediately, when I did my research and searched up Amphictyonic, the first thing that came up was the Amphictyonic League, which is also League and ladies begin with the same letter. It seems like it is this lead on that you expect the next word to be league, but it ends up being ladies. But that is also a very interesting light to think about it through a different lens.
I just remember how many different references you were chasing down and how
so many
the chains of intertextuality are, right? I mean, by way of Shakespeare back to some of the classical references. Jay, you had a question.
Hi, Lauren. It's so great to see you. It's Jay.
Hi.
To see you at the end of this process. And I know about your work in counter storytelling. I remember back to your musical. What was that called?
Yeah, For the Record.
Yeah, For the Record, right? So I remember talking with you about that. And I just want to say that it is definitely time for an Abigail Adams musical. So you should get on that, because we really
I was
need
thinking
that.
about it.
Yeah, well, good. I'm glad you are. I want to ask you about, and I noticed this word, you only used it maybe once or twice in what you just spoke to us, but in the video version, you used the phrase self-actualize a couple times, or self-actualization, and you used it a couple times now, and that word seems like a word. I want to ask you about what work that word is doing for you. My sense of it is that it might be a word that bridges the space between the theater and the literary, or the theater and the textual. I'm not sure about that, but what would you say about that word? It actually surprised me a little bit as the word that you were using. And so I'd love to hear about how you settled on it and what work you think it's doing for you.
Yeah, I feel like I settled on it pretty late in the game, when just trying to better encapsulate my thoughts on what type of work Adams and Warren were doing in these letters, because they both have a similar end goal, but they both go about it very different ways. And I think I started, as the thesis progressed, really starting to dig into the nuances rather than shy away from them. And I didn't want to look at the two of them through a binary lens and say one of them does it right, one of them does it wrong, or one of them is purely stoical, the other one sentimental, or even like dichotomize those terms. But I think ultimately self-actualization, it felt like they were both finding themselves in a new light in these letters that was a more true to who they were, like especially with Warren, where she was able to, in the public sphere, have a voice. She did have public plays and she was a historian, and in some way she kind of represents what Abigail and what Adams was going for. Yet she still wasn't satisfied, and you could see it in the letters that she was doing different work, yet under the same roles. And I think by performing as a historian and as a playwright in her letters, you were able to better see what she truly wanted to put out there, and have a truer identity to the sentimental beliefs that she held, rather than what she was actually putting forth into the public sphere. So I felt like it was just a way to better engage with who these women truly were at their core and what they wanted to say in the public sphere, but might not have been able to, or couldn't speak really much in the public sphere and wanted to get out there in the first place.
I get that. Thank you.
Lauren, this also relates to Professor Weisskopf's question, which will be the last one. She wanted to ask you about the difference between print and epistolary, and the fact that Mercy Otis Warren writes in both of those modes, and how does, she says, how do you see Warren's relation to print affecting her approach to gender and publicness?
Yeah, it was so tricky because if I had more time, or if I had just like devoted my thesis to Warren, I would have really examined her history, since she wrote a history of the American Revolution. And I also would have looked at her plays, because it was super fascinating to me that she was still doing a lot of the allusions to masculine, both antique classical figures, and then also creating those parallels and those bridges to public male figures during the American Revolution. So she was doing similar work to kind of what Abigail was doing in the letters, but that was ultimately in the public sphere. And I think with the print, she was able to kind of, as I just said, like she was able to better experiment and give herself room to experiment. And originally I thought that she was just coming up with characters, because a lot of times she also used her letters to kind of draft her public writing. So she would write character portraits of a lot of historical figures that would end up being in her documentation of her history text, which she was writing during the same time period. But eventually I figured out that while the history text was just really focused on all portraits were of men, in her letter writing, she was able to talk about the domestic dame and what does that mean as a figure, rather than necessarily a specific woman, more classifications of women and classification of female modern day portraits, as she also started to update these portraits and think about how the domestic dame is no longer the domestic dame purely, but is also kind of synonymous now with the manufacturer, because women at this time were now in charge of the manufacturing companies and in charge of creating wool and flax for everyone, because the men were all gone. And so creating updated portraits of both private and now somewhat public, bridged because of the circumstances of the war, creating these portraits of women in the private sphere that she doesn't seem to be able to fully get out in print, though she does. I think there is definitely a connection between the contents of her print and the contents of her epistolary writing and the contents of her print, though I think there are stuff that is unique to her epistolary writing that we wouldn't have gotten otherwise.
Thanks, Lauren. It's such a rich project. And it's just so great the way that you interweave these historical and literary questions. Let's see, we've got to move on. We've got 2 presentations left. Next is going to be Riley Nelson, whose thesis is called "Thy Name is Woman, an examination of cross-gender casting in Hamlet as a method of interrogating gender." So Riley,
yes.
Way.
Thank you. I mean, first, I just want to thank everyone for letting me crash the English colloquium. I did a theater thesis, so bear with me. So my study was in response to this growing trend in English and American theaters, to a lesser extent, of casting women in male Shakespeare roles in response to growing concerns about women being sort of largely excluded from the canon, in this case, Shakespeare. Actually, surprisingly, I didn't realize this, only 13% of all roles in Shakespeare's canon are actually female roles. So unfortunately, there are really varied and sort of unclear opinions in the theater world about what cross-gender casting, as it's called, when an actor performs a role of a different gender, actually does. So some, locate this effect at the individual level, that it just allows more female actors to be employed or to experience a role that they might not otherwise be able to experience. Others hope that it somehow integrates female perspectives into the production, and then there's also sort of a common universality argument that casting women in these male roles allows the concerns of the character to transcend a gendered experience and speak to some, quote unquote, universal humanity. So my research is intended to begin to clarify the possible effects of this form of cross-gender casting, with the idea that future theater makers can be a bit more purposeful when deciding, if and how they use this technique. So I looked at 3 recent British productions of Hamlet, only 2 of which actually featured women in the leading role, to articulate how cross-gender casting in these productions was used to interrogate gender roles, and gender performance. So I first actually looked at David Tennant's 2009 production with the Royal Shakespeare Company as a point of comparison. Tennant actually makes similar performance choices in terms of actually how he portrays masculinity as one of my other productions. So it became a useful production to help isolate some of the more specific effects of cross-gender casting. And then I looked at Maxine Peake's 2014 Hamlet with the Royal Exchange as an example of a more explicitly feminist production of Hamlet. And then finally, I looked at Michelle Terry's 2018 production at the Globe as an example of a production that wasn't sort of outwardly concerned with questions of gender. So in my investigation, I found that each production read really well through a Brechtian lens. So in my analysis, I rely heavily on Ellen Diamond's feminist interpretation of Brecht's alienation effect. And just super quickly, the alienation effect is a representation of something on stage that allows the viewer to recognize the subject, but at the same time view it as strange or unfamiliar, allowing the viewer to see it as if for the first time. And for Brecht, this effect is used to allow viewers to think about things that they might sort of take for granted or don't question through a new critical lens. And for Diamond, this effect can be used to, she says, expose the strictures of gender. So in practice, a performer will quote his or her character as opposed to embodying it, allowing the audience to sort of actively recognize the artifice of performance while watching. So I just quickly wanted to give an example, a little sample of my analysis. So in the David Tennant production, during the Get Thee to a Nunnery scene, Tennant doesn't use any Brechtian performance techniques during his initial exchanges with Ophelia. He plays the role tenderly, truthfully, and we as audience members are not particularly aware of the artifice of his performance until he becomes aware of being watched by Polonius and Claudius. So at this point, his performance, and specifically his performance of gender, changes. He becomes outwardly violent and establishes a gendered power dynamic between himself and Ophelia, portraying a very overt performance of traditional masculinity. His performance of traditional masculinity is obvious because we as audience members glimpsed him sort of turn it on as an actual performance within a performance, and it's overt. The effect is that Hamlet as an overtly masculine figure is alienated, allowing the audience to hopefully criticize the imposition of masculine gender roles on Hamlet. Comparatively, in Maxine Peake's performance of the scene, she sort of similarly performs exaggerated masculinity. She leads with her groin, she walks with a masculine swagger, she rapidly switches between false tenderness and unfeeling aggression towards Ophelia. When Ophelia rejects Hamlet by returning his letters, Peake turns actually sexually violent. She forcibly kisses Ophelia and pulls her onto her lap into a straddle. By performing exaggerated versions of masculinity, both Peake and Tennant alienate Hamlet as an overtly masculine figure, but Tennant never alienates Hamlet's status as a man because Tennant visually registers as male. Peake, on the other hand, is female-bodied, so when she performs exaggerated masculinity, the gap between her sort of corporal form and the character widens, allowing maleness as a whole, as opposed to just masculine gender roles. Alienating that, I don't know if I said aloud. The result is that the audience identification with the male Hamlet is prevented, decentering Hamlet as the subject of the scene, and actually re-centering Ophelia. And this is due to a couple of reasons. I mean, one, they actually removed To Be or Not to Be from this scene and move it sort of later in the play, so it causes Ophelia to just be the focus of the scene. And then also she doesn't use any Brechtian performance techniques, so she actually embodies the character and the audience is able to identify with her. And then it also characterized masculinity itself as violent towards women, because Peake's performance of masculinity is inextricable from her performance of aggression and sexual violence. So I also looked at a very different use of cross-gender casting with Michelle Terry's production at the Globe, but for the sake of time, I will now open it up for questions.
Thanks, Riley. And one of the things I love about this, I don't have a question right now, but just to say that the way in which you tease out the different effects of cross-gender casting, right? That there's not a sort of implicit politics to it. There's a politics, but it has to be worked out, and it can work in very different ways. Is just so illuminating. Yeah. Questions for Riley? I see Jeff's hand up, and then Nathan.
Hi, everybody. Riley, we haven't met, but I really enjoyed watching your video and thinking about these productions. I'd just been teaching the Peake Hamlet in my Hamlet class. So, wow. And we just had a very rich discussion of the trans, non-binary, and sexualities of that production. So I really enjoyed that you're working on it. It's such a rich production, as you know. And as you said in your video, I wanted to, I had two questions. One was whether these current productions with their interesting cross-gender casting, if in the interviews that you read and you referenced in the video, if they make any connection to much earlier women Hamlets like Sarah Bernhardt or Asta Nielsen. So that's kind of question number one. And the second thing I just was thinking about is, do you see a tension between the Globe's otherwise obsessive use of authenticity in their productions around costuming, around the very construction of the building, around making the audience stand and so forth, and this their commitment to cross-gender casting, and
Yeah.
where do you see that kind of emerge in the production?
Thank you so much. Going to your first question, I also had the same question when I started looking at my thesis. I actually started looking at like Sarah Siddon, Sarah Bernhardt. And what's interesting is that I wasn't seeing a whole lot of connection between these contemporary female Hamlets and the original female Hamlets. And I think part of the reason for that is just they were coming about for very different reasons. So some of the research that I was doing over the summer was suggesting that these like very original female Hamlets were in some ways actually to please male audiences because they provided breeches roles where women would, perform as men, and therefore they would wear pants, and therefore male audiences would get to see their legs, and therefore ticket sales would go up. And so a lot of these female Hamlets were happening actually at benefit performances. So not that I can find yet, but I think that would definitely be an area to continue exploring. And then your second question about the tension between the Globe's like original practices and this. Yeah. It was interesting because the interview that I referenced with Michelle Terry suggested that like the decision to engage in this, she calls it gender blind casting. I'm not certain that's the case though, is because, and she said Shakespeare wasn't concerned about gender because if we recall, he had all men playing all the roles. So why should we? So she seems to suggest that that is sort of like a continuation or perhaps like an evolution of what Shakespeare was originally doing. But one of the sort of odd parts of this production is that you got the sense that, or I did at least, that some of the choices that they were making in terms of like what they were doing with cross-gender casting seemed to rest on the surface of the production, as opposed to like directly engaging with some of the themes of the production. I mean, obviously Hamlet's, quite concerned with questions of performance and meta-theatricality, and I think that there's some, it dovetails there a little bit, but like, it's a lot different from like the Maxine Peake production, which I think is more explicitly concerned with the themes of the text. So I don't know, I guess I saw a little bit of tension there, and it seems that you could have done, what they did with casting to any production of Shakespeare, not specifically Hamlet.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Nathan.
Yeah, so I'm in Professor Maston's class, and he very handily stole both the questions I was going to ask, but that's all right. No, I'm actually writing a paper on the Peake production as we speak, and I really found it fascinating. I'm so excited to read more about it from you. I guess one question I had more broadly is, and something that we talked about in class, was the heavily binarized undertones of the term gender swapped, or that idea of cross-gender, and where a non-binary reading or a gender fluid reading of something like the Peake production comes into play. And then something that I was personally really interested in, and I'm kind of writing about right now, is what the effect of the contemporary costume design for the Peake production has, or how that bears on the work it does with gender. It's set in this very corporate setting. Claudius is kind of a CEO. What does that do to gender, and what does it say?
Mm-hmm. Those are interesting questions. You know, I think with the idea of a non-binary reading, I agree that gender is, and specifically Peak's performance of gender is fluid in this production, in that it starts in this sort of non-binary or agendered space, in that it's very difficult to place what gender she's playing. She's not really offering any specific gender cues. And then when Hamlet starts to, depends on your interpretation of the play, feign madness, actually go mad, basically any point after Hamlet's interaction with the ghost, at that point she starts to perform really sort of over the top, as I was describing in my little speech, really sort of a caricature of masculinity. And even that sort of starts to go in and out depending on like what character she's around, which, I mean, my initial thoughts are like at the moment are just that like it speaks to sort of societal pressures of gender conforming, that perhaps we all start at this sort of like agendered space, and then walking actually like through the world based off of sort of societal influences, then we have to construct and perform our gender and fit certain gender roles to meet them. But that's a really interesting question. I'm gonna have to think more of that. I think I was thinking so in terms of binaries in these works. Remind me of your second question.
It's just, sorry, I know there's a lot, but I really loved your answer, by the way. Just thinking about kind of the corporate aesthetics of peak production and what that does to gender.
I don't necessarily have an answer for you at the moment with Peak, but one of the things that I was thinking about with Polonius, actually, who in this production is changed to Polonia. She is a woman, but she's very much, a corporate dressed figure. She's in sort of a pantsuit. Is that I was looking at that in terms of like a critique of Thatcherism, in that I think that Polonia, basically, as she is Polonius, she is in the position of having to get ahead within the system of power of the court. So she is, having to ingratiate herself with Claudius. She's having to sell out her own daughter, and putting her. So she sort of like aesthetically has a sort of aesthetic resonance with Margaret Thatcher, which shares in this sort of like socialist feminist critique of Thatcher. As sort of an example of like anti-feminism, but also a critique of what women have to do to get ahead if they are working within the system of power, as opposed to dismantling the system of power. So in some ways, it's sort of a tragic portrayal, I guess, of Polonia and also women working within the system.
Thanks, Riley. Let's give Riley a big hand.
Thank you.
It was lovely. It was such a pleasure to have you be part of our group all year. You added so much to the conversation, as did everyone in the seminar. And now we have our final presentation from San Nguyen. Her thesis was called "When Women Teach: Female Pedagogues on the Early Modern Stage." Sam?
Hi, yes, so as the last person, I just want to shout out to all the people in my cohort who I think you guys did like an amazing job today, and shout out as well to all the people who are here. It's an honor, but also a lot of pressure to be the last person, because now I feel like I need to end this on a positive note. So I'm going to keep my presentation brief. Bump Professor Davis' comment in the chat about the Taiwanese film production of As You Like It, because very on point, my thesis also studied As You Like It, which is something that I want to focus on. in the presentation today. So as you can tell from the title, my thesis is at the intersection of education, gender studies, and also performance in theater. Basically, it examines portrayals of female pedagogues in 2 early modern plays titled Love's Cure and As You Like It, to interrogate and restructure period assumptions about female passivity and also the sex and gender divide that disregarded women's pedagogical capabilities in the first place. And so, like I said, I studied Love's Cure, which is a much lesser known play published in 1647 it was written by Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher. And As You Like It, a much more canonical play by Shakespeare. So I really wanted to talk about Love's Cure, but I think that it would be, I guess, more convenient to talk about As You Like It, because I assume that a lot more people here will have read it than the other play. So I will talk about As You Like It. So basically, just a little bit of background. There is this assumption in the early modern, which is based on this crazy, wild theory of the anatomy by Galen, that women's and men's genitalia are homologous, but like because there was a lack of heat during gestation, women's genitalia fail to extrude, and therefore they're basically just like incomplete men or men turned outside in, which if you think about it now, it's kind of crazy, but you know, that was the kind of theory a lot of people bought back in the day. So my thesis is in conversation with that, but I wasn't like necessarily fighting that theory myself, because a lot of people have proved that that theory is just bonker. But I kind of want to show how the women in the plays that I study resist that particular theory. And so I want to share my screen and shows this like very brief example of how I show Rosalind, being the main character in As You Like It, resisting the theory or the idea that women are incomplete men. And so here is a brief interaction between Rosalind. She's currently disguised as a man by the name of Ganymede, and she's talking to Orlando, who is her love interest. Orlando doesn't know that Ganymede is Rosalind. So basically in this interaction, Rosalind is saying that Ganymede, you're not in love because look at you. You don't look like a man in love at all, and here is why. And then she goes ahead to list out all these different symptoms of non-lovers, as I call it, that she can spot in Orlando. So my argument here basically is that she repeats a phrase which you have not like 4 times, and she attached the negative prefix onto every single adjective that she can find or she can like snuff in here, kind of to show or to sort of relegate this negative space, this incompleteness, this lacking or needing mode of being onto Orlando, who's a man. And Rosalind, being a woman, being the supposedly incomplete man doing this, it really pushed this idea that even in the early modern period, women are resisting. So more broadly speaking, my thesis sort of, or at least I hope to show that, you know, there's this sort of assumptions about the uninterrupted patriarchy in the early modern, but my thesis, I hope, push back against that, and that women are always resisting and women are cool and awesome and they're doing all the best they can to push back against, even incrementally, they're always resisting, always pushing back on these patriarchal assumptions and limitations. But also more broadly speaking, like I said, because my thesis concerns itself a lot with education, this thesis, I mean, when I started out, I sort of studied As You Like It and also Love's Cure from the perspective that women are going to be students. And then as I was working through this, I realized that women are more awesome than that, and they can also be teachers. And so that was when I like sort of like shifted my focus and started studying women as pedagogues. And so I think that by studying these female pedagogues, I really was able to point out like just good education and good like teaching methods in general, of like them accommodating to the students that they're teaching, of them meeting the student where they are. So I'm sorry, this is like kind of going all over the place, but hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, that is all I have for now. Let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks, Sam. That was great. And I think, that was one of the things that was so great about your thesis was you're talking about gender and performance, which is, has been talked about a lot in the early modern period, but to think about it through this lens of the pedagogues, I think, and how pedagogy works in the play was just a really unusual and illuminating way. As you said, you can see women being able to do so much more, right? Let's see, do we have questions for Sam? Casey, you have a hand up already. Oh, Sam, did you want to respond to that? No?
Well, not really. I just wanted to add like one final thing that I'm so sorry I missed this, but thank you, Paulina, for pointing this out. I want to thank Professor Masson specifically because I read Love Spirit in his class, and that was basically the foundation for this thesis. So special shout out to Professor Masson, of course, Professor Evans. She's my wonderful, best advisor I could ask for.
Casey, go ahead.
What is happening?
Hi, Sam. I love every time we talk about this project. I just love it more. There's such richness here, and there's so much to say. But today I'm going to ask you a devil's advocate question. That you're talking about women as pedagogues, but of course we're more specifically talking about female characters as pedagogues, right? And they're female characters written by men, either individually or in collaboration, and who would originally have been played by male actors. And so I wonder if you want to speculate about, like, if I were hostile to this project, which I'm not in the slightest, as you know, I would say, oh, those aren't real women. They're men play acting as women, but the pedagogical part is still masculine, right? And so how would you, besides telling me, where I can put that kind of skepticism, do you have a sense of how you would respond to that kind of skeptical reader? And I don't count myself among such skeptical readers, but that's a kind of response that sometimes one encounters when wanting to talk about women in the context of the early modern stage, when we don't have female bodies per se playing those parts.
Thank you. That was a very tough question, but I really appreciate it. I think that, to be honest, that's like a very fair criticism, I think, because we're unfortunate in the sense that we're dealing with a time period where women weren't even allowed on stage. So there's like, I can't really say anything about like having women occupying the stage in that time period. Although I do think that, like, even though they're men, the supposed gender or the persona that they are occupying still female, right? So it still carries that implications that women can do this. So it opens more of a potential or a possibility for resistance than like actual resistance by women, I suppose, because in the audience, for example, a young girl can watch this play and think, oh, if women, or if this particular, in quotation mark, woman on stage can do this, can exactly sort of subversion from within, or can teach men, then I can also do it outside of like, the stage, outside of when you go and watch a performance, hopefully you like suspend your belief for a moment and you like do really, think of these people as women. But at the same time, I think outside of that fictional sphere, there will be ripple effects in the like actual audience itself, or at least that's what I hope. I also like have thought about the question, so I'm really curious to study like plays written by women themselves and see how I might be able to find more concrete examples or instances of women playwrights portraying women pushing back on these patriarchal beliefs. So yeah, that probably would be a future project. But thank you so much for the question.
Jeff, you're next.
Oh, I'm going to pass to Paulina. and you can come back to me.
Okay.
Are you sure that's like passing the like Romeo soliloquy to like stage actor on the left? Are you sure about that, Jeff?
I'm positive.
Okay.
I want to hear your question.
Oh no. Okay, now I'm on the spot. I have to say that my Love's Cure Nerd Fest got interrupted by the pandemic in March 2020. So I feel like this is a Love's Cure nerd out, like over a year in the making. But I was wondering specifically about Love's Cure, Sam, if you could talk about the space of teaching in the play more broadly, because I think that you were talking about how there's both the woman dressed as a man teaching Lucio how to be a man, and then there's actual or sort of, men who are assumed to be biological men who are teaching him the purposes of masculinity. So I was wondering if you could put it in the context of the role of education and pedagogy in the play more broadly.
Yeah, so just to recap, Love's Cure tells the stories of two siblings, one girl, one guy, and they've been brought up separately as members of opposite sex. And now the whole family is reunited, and they're committed to sort of convert back to the behaviors that are expected of their associated with their biological sex. So there's a lot of layers of like cross-dressing, and it's complicated, but basically my thesis studies this particular relationship between Lucio, which is one of the two siblings. So Lucio was brought up as a girl, and then now he like falls in love with this woman, Genevora. She is a woman, she dresses as a woman, she acts supposedly like the way that women were expected to act back then. And so I think particularly about their relationships, to me, that relationship is both erotic and like sexual and like, between two adults who can relate to one another with desire, but also it's very pedagogical in the sense that Genevora is teaching Lucio how to become a man. Because again, Lucio was brought up as a woman, and his father and other guys in the play, other men in the play, have attempted to teach him how to fight, how to drink, how to, socialize as a man, but they failed to do so. So Jennifer stepped in, and with sort of like this erotic interactions between the two of them, she's like slowly converting him or inspiring a new masculine soul into him. And I'm quoting the play. But I think that the spotlight of her, or the best thing about her teaching, is not in her conversion of his gender, but more in her ability to recognize that, he has this power to become feminine, and he has the power to become masculine, and she's gonna capitalize on that to her benefit as well. She's like, in this particular situation, it's better to be masculine. In this particular situation, it's better to be feminine. And I'm going to teach you how to fluidly move between those different gender characteristics instead of forcing you to be something like to be contained within particular gender or particular behaviors. So I think that is the actual teaching that she does, that Genevora does in the play, rather than just, telling him you have to be a man or you have to not be a woman. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, definitely. That's fascinating to think of the character who is more gender fluid sort of teaching Lucio about the fluidity of gender, as opposed to the, more normatively gendered characters that are trying to teach him about the rigidity of gender, is what I'm hearing from you, at least.
Yeah.
Jeff, can we come back to you?
Sure. Sam, as you know, I read your thesis and really loved it, and it taught me a lot. So I was really pleased to read it. I think just hearing you talk right now, I'm struck again by something that's in your thesis, which is that the men in Love's Cure are such bad teachers, right? And or the normatively gendered men are such bad teachers in that play, and that's terrific to think about. I wanted to ask you, I have a couple questions for you, but I'm just going to ask one, which is, I wanted to ask a kind of version of Professor Hodge's question to Caroline to think about the issue of canonicity in relation to your work, because as you suggested by not talking about Love's Cure today, As You Like It is a play everybody knows, and nobody except a happy few of us know Love's Cure. And so I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the kind of traction you get from talking about the non-canonical play that nobody knows alongside the play that everybody thinks that they already know.
Yeah, so I thought a lot about that when I was writing my pieces. So thank you for your questions. I actually started out wanting to study just Love's Cure. There was no Shakespeare, no As You Like It in the picture, because I was sort of on a non-canonical kick where I just wanted to study like non-canonical text. But I think that while it is important for us to like study and introduce new texts that are lesser known, I think that by pairing these two texts together, one very canonical and one lesser known, I feel like I can prepare not only help situate the lesser known text within like a longer traditions of texts that are known, but also to help prepare readers to look at the canonical text in ways that they might not know before, they never have thought about before. So that's the reasoning behind pairing these two texts together. I also, in my thesis, I write about Love's Cure before As You Like It. So there's a lot of, it's a lesser known play. So I have the freedom to say a lot of things that, not many people have said before, have studied before. So setting that up as the foundation or framework for thinking about As You Like It was actually very productive, at least in my writing process, to think about, women teaching men, but in terms of like how to become better men, how to become better lovers, were things that I never really thought about when I first read As You Like It, because I was so concerned about this like feminist questions of like Rosalind, just focusing on Rosalind. And I'm still focusing on Rosalind, but I'm also focusing on her interaction with other characters in the play, especially Orlando. And I think that the kind of reading that I did for the example that I showed before with the which you have not or the unadjective, I think that that's something I definitely didn't get from any of the like classes that, I've taken on As You Like It. So hopefully that was like a new contribution on my part. But things like that, like really drawing people's attention to aspects of a canonical play that they might not have thought about before, I think is as valuable as introducing a new text, because, with these canonical plays, like it can be a new text anytime, as long as you can find new things to say about it, which I realize is difficult, but, it's not impossible.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Sam. Let's thank Sam. And, another round of applause for all the students. I mean, these were excellent presentations, fantastic theses. And, as you guys know, I mean, every honor seminar was this kind of conversation for us. So it's been an absolute pleasure for me all year. We should thank the advisors again as well. I mean, they have really done a marvelous job over this year. After this long, hard year, I've only met Melissa because she was in my English 300, and we are all meeting finally today after it's all over. We're going to be able to get together this afternoon, which I'm really excited to meet everyone. Thank you guys for a marvelous year. Thanks for all of you for attending on a beautiful day, and we will see each other in the department again soon. Bye, everyone.